Y'all, let's sew up some Y2K flares. I'm using this French terry. They're for my daughter. Here's the right side is this leopard print and the wrong side is just a plain gray. Doing the pockets, regular waistband with drawstring, and the full length here. We're going to start out with our pocket piece if you're doing the pockets, and we're going to press the top section down 1/2 inch and pin in place. There's 2 mirror images, so you're going to do the same thing to your other pocket piece. Make sure that you grabbed your pocket piece and not your pocket backing. The pocket piece will be very slightly shorter than your pocket backing. Then once we hem it down, it'll be even shorter, and that's what will create that little spot where you can put your hands in. So make sure you're grabbing your pocket piece and not your pocket backing piece to hem along the top. I'm using my regular sewing machine here. I love to use a triple step zigzag when I'm using my regular sewing machine. You can use whatever stretch stitch that you like the look of. You can also use a cover stitch machine if you're lucky enough to have one of those. I often use that. I use the sewing machine when I do videos, so I'm not moving around to so many machines. And so if you don't have a cover stitch machine, you can see it looks great on just a regular sewing machine. A triple step zigzag is really great for high stretch knits. Now this French terry is surprisingly stretchy for a French terry. It's like a poly rayon blend. Most French terries, first of all, wouldn't be quite stretchy enough for this pattern and wouldn't need such a high stretch stitch. My favorite fabrics for this pattern have been cotton spandex, athletic knits, double brush poly. Those were me and my daughter's favorites. We made a pair of fleece back athletic fabric, and we both adore that pair. If you're looking for fabric suggestions, I chose this French terry mostly because it had a really great front and back. She did end up loving this pair, but again, this is a really stretchy French terry, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend French terry for this pattern unless you happen to have a super soft stretchy one like this one. Now what we're doing is grabbing our pocket backing, and we're going to pin our pocket to our pocket backing along the edges where they match. And as you can see, the pocket backing now sticks up about 1 inch taller than your pocket piece. Hopefully you didn't skip on cutting out the notches. Those just make sure you have not forgotten which way your pocket goes, especially if you're using something like a cotton spandex and it's really easy to get the right and the wrong side kind of mixed up. The notch will help make sure that you're creating 2 mirror pieces, so a right pocket and a left pocket, and not accidentally creating 2 left pockets, right? And now that we're all pinned up on both pocket pieces, what we're going to do is baste around the edges. So you're going to do your longest straight stitch on your machine, which is typically a 5 stitch length. I accidentally didn't click mine all the way, so mine says 4.5. A basting stitch is just to temporarily hold these pieces in place. I would not skip this though, especially because these pockets have a curve and you have to kind of ease the 2 curves into each other. It makes it so much easier if you just baste these together, and it only takes a few seconds. I promise it's worth the time that it takes for the ease that it makes sewing these pockets to the front piece in the next step. I would definitely not skip the basting. I am always a pretty big fan of basting. I think it only takes a few seconds. It's really easy to fix basting if you don't get something perfect. You know, you can rip out a basting stitch so much quicker than a regular final stitch. So over the years, I've learned that basting is your friend. Next up, we're going to grab our front pieces. Now, the front pieces, if you're doing the pockets, almost look like it has two crotch curves, if you can see. I'm doing a youth size, so the pockets are actually bigger than the crotch curve, but you do want to make sure that you're attaching it to the pocket cut line and not, in fact, the crotch curve. On some sizes, it can look a little bit similar. The pocket is a much more circular oval curve, and the crotch curve is much more shallow, but just take your time and make sure you are in fact attaching your pocket piece to the pocket cut line on the outside of your front piece. Here's the part where we're going to ease in a little bit. They are 1-to-1 at the seam allowance, but because they're two curves, there's a little bit of easing in. Shouldn't be much, and with the stretch fabric, it should feel like pretty much nothing, but there is a little bit of easing in there. As always, I highly suggest pinning at the top and the bottom, and then adding pins through the middle. That's any pieces, anytime you're sewing, anytime you're pinning things together. You can do some at the top, then I move to the bottom, and then go in between. This technique really helps. Make sure you're not accidentally stretching either side or accidentally easing it in slightly, because even just a little tiny bit over, a long length can make a big difference. So it's a really good habit to pin at the top, pin at the bottom, then add between. Moving over to my serger. If you don't have a serger, you can sew this whole thing up on a regular sewing machine, no problem. You just need to use whatever stretch stitch you like for construction, like a lightning stitch, triple step, straight stitch, whatever you like, and normally use on knit fabrics. We're doing a 1/2 inch seam allowance on this whole pattern, so that goes for this section too. And again, we're just sewing the pockets to the front piece. There we go. Give this a nice little press once you're done. Then we'll just repeat on the other side. Again, make sure that you're using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Since it's curves, I see a lot of sewists kind of skimp on the seam allowance around curves for whatever reason. So make sure you're using that full 1/2 inch seam allowance, or this little area will end up a little bit loose. There we go. Again, you want to give that a press on your iron, and then you can top stitch the seam. I like to top stitch the seam allowance going away from the pocket, but you could top stitch whichever way you like, or you could skip it altogether, whatever your preference. Here I am top stitching again the seam allowance pressed away from the pocket, and I'm using that same triple step zigzag that I use to hem along the top of the pants. You do want to make sure you're using a stretch stitch for your top stitching, because you need this to stretch along with your fabric when you put it on. There we go, there's mine. You can give it another press if you did top stitch. Press before you top stitch, very important, and then again after. If you do not press in between sewing your stitch and top stitching, you can really make that seam stretched out and wavy, because if it has stretched out at all with the sewing, you need to press it to pull it back to shape before top stitching it and stretching it a little bit again. Okay, so sew it, press it so that it bounces back to shape, then top stitch. If it gets stretched out a little bit, just press it again and it should bounce back to shape. If you skip the pressing, that's when you end up with those kind of stretched out wavy seams that you're not going to be happy with. Now I'm grabbing my back piece, my front piece, and aligning them along the side seams. Here's my notches right here. If you're like me and you're using a serger for most of your construction, you're going to want to stitch near your notch on the side seam on your sewing machine. You will not get a nice, clean side seam vent if you just use your serger, okay? A lot of people don't like to hear that, but I'm here to tell you, if you want a nice, clean side seam vent, you need to stitch from the notch 2 or 3 inches up your side seam with your normal sewing machine. And I'll show you how I do it, to where I just connect the serger to that little bit at the bottom. Now, if you're using a sewing machine on the whole thing, don't worry about it. Go from the top all the way to that notch and you're good to go. It's just if you're using a serger that you need to do this little section right here. So I'm sewing from 2 or 3 inches above the notch down to the notch with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm actually just using a straight stitch here. My fabric didn't have a ton of vertical stretch. It's just a couple inches. I was not worried about this seam popping. I trimmed off my notch, and then I trim into the seam allowance just like this, not through my stitch line, but pretty close up to it. Now I'm going to take it over to my serger. Again, if you're using a sewing machine for the whole construction, just go from top to the bottom to the notch. Now we're using a 1/2 inch seam allowance again here. We're just going from the top of the pant down the outer leg, using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, which means trimming off 1/4 inch there. And here is where we clipped in, and we're just going to go off right there. That way we have the full intact seam allowance at that bottom section near the notch, and that's what you need to get a nice clean finish on that side seam vent. You need to leave the full 1/2 inch seam allowance intact. Now repeat on the opposite side. And then what we're going to do from there is pin together, right sides together, our inseam. So you can leave exactly how you just sewed it. And this time we're just going to match the inseam, the inner leg. Again, you'll see me pin at the top. Now I'm pinning at the bottom, and then I'll pin all along the middle. It's really a necessity when you're doing pants, especially because the back piece is always curvier than the front piece, because we have a lot more curves going on in the back than the front in general. And so our back crotch curve is a lot deeper than our front crotch curve. And that means we need to ease the back into the front ever so slightly. They're the same length vertically, but since the back piece is wider and curvier, we'll need to ease that back piece into the front piece. So I always suggest pinning at the top and the bottom, and then along the middle. That will help. Another thing that will help is when you're sewing, put the back piece down and your front piece on top, and your sewing machine will naturally ease in that little extra bit. A lot of times on knit pants, you won't notice as much, but on woven pants, you'll notice that ease a lot more. Okay, we're just going to repeat on the other leg. And then what we're going to do is we're going to flip one leg. It does not matter which one, the right or the left side. Right side's out, while leaving the other one wrong side's out. what you're going to do is I like to stick my hand inside, the right sides out, and shove it down the leg of the wrong sides out. And what that will do is put your legs right sides together. And we're going to pin them along the crotch curve. So here's my inner leg seam, my inseam right here, the center of the crotch part. And then we're going to pin or clip up the front crotch curve and up the back crotch curve, so up the center front of your pants and the center back of your pants. They should be exactly the same. We cut these as two mirror images, so as long as you sewed your seam allowances correct in the inseam, it should line up nice and perfectly. And then we're just going to stitch this crotch curve. It's kind of like a U shape, right? With a 1/2 inch seam allowance like we have been using. Personally, I like to always stitch starting at the front crotch curve. I like to stitch the front crotch curve down and then come up the back. I'm not sure why this habit started, but I sew it like this every single time. So you'll see me always start at the front and then go up the back. And press this seam. You can top stitch this seam if you would like. I do not top stitch this seam. Actually, I don't think I top stitch any more seams besides the pockets on this one. I did the regular waistband with a drawstring, so I'm just adding 2 little buttonholes here. You can also use little eyelets or grommets if you would like. Either way, you're going to want to make sure you add a little bit of interfacing wherever you're going to put your buttonholes or grommets, eyelets, whatever you want to use. I find buttonholes to be nice and quick and easy, so that's what you'll see me use most of the time on mine. There are markings on the pattern piece if you would like to follow exactly where I like to put my buttonholes and drawstring casing. Once you're done with your buttonholes, your grommets, whatever you have, you can move on to sewing the rest of the waistband. So whether you're doing the regular waistband or the fold over yoga waistband, they're sewn the same way. So we're going to fold them right sides together horizontally, and we're going to stitch down this little seam right here and create a circle. I'm going to move to my serger. Again, you can do that on your sewing machine if that's what you prefer, or if that's what you have. Use a 1/2 inch seam allowance here. Now we're going to fold it wrong sides together vertically, and you can see it now looks like a little waistband. We are going to mark this into even quarters, so your center front. You can see I always mark any pattern piece that I cut out on the fold. I automatically cut a little notch, and that way I always have my center front, center back marked on my pattern piece. It's a really quick and easy tip. If you sew a lot, you should definitely try that one out. It's a great habit to have. It's so much quicker cutting that little notch while you're cutting than it is to find the center once you're sewing. Now we're at even quarters on our waistband. We're going to do the same thing with our bottoms. Find our even quarter points, which our center front will be the center front seam, center back will be our center back seam, and then you can put those on top of each other and walk to the sides to find your quarter mark on the side. The youth, the side seam is pretty close to the quarter point. On the adult though, the back is wider than the front since we are curvier and wider on the back. So do not use the side seams as your quarter point on the adult pair. On the youth, it is pretty close, I believe. They're not quite as curvy as the adult size chart. The waistband is very slightly smaller than the main pant. If you're using a pretty stretchy fabric, you probably won't even notice. So it feels almost like it's 1-to-1, but it's not. The waistband is slightly smaller, so I like to put the main pant down on the bottom and have the waistband on top. That way the sewing machine will help ease in that little extra and you won't have to stretch the waistband to fit as much. It does some of the work for you. But you should have to stretch the waistband ever so slightly to fit to your pant, and then we're just going to stitch them together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. If you did put in grommets or buttonholes, make sure that's right sides down, touching your main part of your pants, so that when we flip our waistband up, that drawstring will be on the outside. It's really easy to forget, especially if you're like me and usually put in those buttonholes or grommets at the very first of beginning to sew your garment. For the video, I did not. I waited, but I often will do that at the very beginning because I don't like to change my sewing feet in the middle of sewing. So give that seam a press. You can top stitch that seam if you would like. If you're a big fan of top stitching, go for it. I'm just going to use my seam ripper to open my buttonholes for my drawstring right here. You can also use little tiny snips or embroidery scissors, something nice and small to get those open. Next up, if you're doing the drawstring option like me, you're going to want to sew your drawstring. You can use some sort of pre-made drawstring. I've been known to use shoelaces, twill tape, whatever you can find in the trim section, whatever you like. But I do like to show how I like to make drawstrings just in case you need help. I like to sew it with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so it's really a pretty small, narrow piece, and then you stitch it together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And this is it. You go down, 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 and then we'll flip it right sides out. And that's it. It's really nice and quick and easy if you don't have any kind of pre-made type drawstring on hand. Usually you can get this little narrow piece out of your scraps. I often will cut it cross grain because that is a little narrow piece that I have like along the pant leg vertically in my scraps, because the drawstring really doesn't need to stretch that much. It's no big deal if it doesn't stretch that much since you're cutting it vertically. That's what I do most of the time when I'm making little drawstrings like that. All right, and now I'm just going to use a little safety pin. It's my favorite for turning little drawstrings through. I've got a lot of turning tools that I've had over the years. Nothing beats a little safety pin on a drawstring, I don't think, personally. But you can use whatever turning method you like and turn it right sides out. Okay, now I'm going to speed up this section of me just feeding the safety pin through and turning the drawstring right sides out because I don't want to bore anybody. So once we're done, we're going to be able to feed this through. I just leave that safety pin still attached, and I will use it to feed it through my buttonholes here in the waistband. Now you can top stitch a casing onto this as well, which I do think is really cute if you like to do that. I have markings on the pattern piece, and it just goes, right above your buttonhole and right below your buttonhole or grommets. And you just want to use a stretch stitch. So here I am, I'm going to use that same stretch stitch that I've been using for top stitching. And I'm just going to go around the entire waistband in a nice straight line. So however far away from the top folded edge you want, you're going to go around the whole way. Okay. So depending on how big your grommets are or buttonholes are, you want to make your casing big enough that you're not needing to stitch on top of the casing or the buttonholes, obviously. Again, I'm going to speed this up because I'm just top stitching here. This is an optional step. You don't have to top stitch the casing onto the waistband. It doesn't function other than just holding your drawstring in place along the waistband. It will work and function perfectly fine without the top stitching, but it is an awful cute detail when you're done. I hardly ever skip it. I think it's a very cute detail. So, and now we're just going to use a safety pin or whatever your favorite feeding tool is, bodkin or whatever you like, to feed our drawstring through the waistband. Whether you did the stitching lines like me and created a little casing or not. Should be fairly quick and easy to do. Your drawstring should be pretty narrow compared to your casing, so it's not a tight fit. Nice and easy to feed it through this time. Now, once you get it kind of nice and even on both sides, what I like to do is tie off the ends. I don't really finish the ends of my knit drawstrings. Don't find it necessary. I tie it off so that my serger threads don't become unraveled. But the knit fabric won't fray, and so I always just tie them in a knot. Sometimes I do little loops on the bottom and tie them in a knot. Sometimes I just literally tie them in a knot like this time. You can tuck them inside and stitch them closed if you prefer that look though. I also like to stitch in the ditch on the back seam on the waistband. This just makes sure that that drawstring never gets pulled out completely and you have to feed it through, or that it gets too off-centered. Sometimes that happens, especially with little ones, but even just like in the wash and everything, it might get pulled really funky. If you stitch in the ditch in the back seam, it kind of stops that from happening. Next up, all we're going to do is hem. So if you did the full length like me and you got to sew up your side splits, you're going to press it 1/2 inch to the wrong side. So basically that seam allowance we left intact, we're just going to press down both side seams. The out seam, well, I guess they're both on the out seam, but one on the front leg and one on the back leg. Then we're just gonna hem it. I'm using a triple step zigzag again. And you just want to stitch along that raw edge that is folded up, just like anytime you hem. I am stitching from the top side. You can stitch from the bottom side where you can see the edge. Probably easier if you're a beginner. I know my seam allowances really well, and so I can stitch from the top side no problem. As a beginner, I used to always stitch from the underside just so I could see that raw edge underneath. When you get to the top, you have a few options. You can either go like a triangle, nice and pointed and pivot. You can kind of curve it off in a really sharp curve, or you can box it off where you can go straight up the side, pivot, go straight across the top, pivot, and then start going down. Whatever you like the look of, it all finishes the same way as long as you're hemming along both sides and connecting the top in some way that you find aesthetically pleasing. You're good to go. I usually do a sharp curve around the top. Just find it the easiest, and I like the way that looks. So that's what mine looks like. And I usually do that same method on my cover stitch as well. Now we're just hemming along the bottom. So again, just folding up 1/2 inch and stitching along that raw edge. Nice and easy. You do want to make sure you're using a stretch stitch here, because even though this area isn't going to be stretched while you're wearing it, if say you accidentally, someone steps on your pants, or you step on your pants, or maybe while you're putting them on you accidentally step on the bottom of the pants, you still want your stitches to be able to stretch with the fabric. Or else when you do have those little incidences where you're stretching the fabric, again, usually it's like when you step on the bottom of your pants in some way and the fabric will stretch, your hem is going to pop stitches if your stitch doesn't stretch. So even though this does not stretch when it's on in any way, it might happen, and you don't want them to pop stitches if it does. So I still suggest using a stretch stitch here while hemming the bottom. It does not need to be a super stretchy stitch unless your fabric happens to be super stretchy. And we're almost done. You're just going to repeat this exact same hemming on your other leg and give everything a nice press, especially the hems. If you're still learning how to hem knits and not get them a little stretched and wavy, a really nice good press will help you get it to bounce back into shape. And we're all done. I hope you enjoyed sewing along with me. If you sewed some up, don't forget to share them with us on social media and tag us. I absolutely love seeing your sewing successes. Until next time, bye y'all.